Jesus gets angry today. This didn't just happen because of a one-off action or because of one thing that Jesus was annoyed about. In one sense, there were 3 strikes that happened. This happens in some sports, 3 strikes and you're out. There were 3 major problems with what was happening in today's gospel. And Jesus just couldn't stand by and let it go on. There are 3 missions of Christ, 3 missions of the church. And what's occurring in this story today, where Jesus goes up to Jerusalem, more than likely 12 months before his death. We're told it's at the Feast of Passover, but Jesus is not killed at this time. Jesus realizes that he cannot stay silent. Sometimes you can stay silent within your own family or in your own context, one bad thing's happening. Sometimes when 2 bad things are happening, you think, I'm tempted to say something. When 3 things happen, sometimes we react. And that's what Jesus does in the gospel. He reacts. And he has zeal for the house of the Lord. So the first strike is in relation to the worship of God. We are called, when we come to the temple, when we come to the church, we are actually called to have right worship of God. The church is not meant to be Westfields. The church is not meant to be the market square. But what was happening is people were coming to the temple to worship, and there was no worship of God going on at all. That's a pretty big strike. And Jesus reacts not just to that, but for 2 other things. The beginning of our first reading today, we had the 10 Commandments. For a lot of people, they focus on the 10 Commandments from the last few commandments. Don't kill, don't steal, don't take things from your neighbours. But people forget that most of the commandments are about the worship of God, are about a relationship with God, about keeping holy the day of the Lord, about keeping holy the name of the Lord, about the way we worship. And so we are called to be people who are of the right worship of God. It's not about ourselves, it's not about making money, it's not about ripping other people off. It's about honouring God and worshipping God. And Jesus comes into the temple and sees this is not going on. That's a big strike. When we come to church, if the purpose of coming to church is to make ourselves wealthier financially in this world, if we are looking for prosperity when we come to church, you've come to the wrong place. We are here to worship God. That's what we're here for. And Jesus reminded everybody in this context today that we are about the right worship of God. Our previous Pope, Pope Benedict, spent quite a reasonable time reflecting on this and encouraging Catholics that when we come to pray, it's not just about community, it's not just about how we do great things in the world, it's about the right worship of God. We can't forget that. And that was the first big strike, you could say, that happened. The second is relation to the second mission of Christ, the mission of the church. The second mission of the church is that we are called to bring Christ to the world and to others. According to scholars, that this event that happened in the gospel, where Jesus drives out the money changers, drives out the cattle, the sheep, and so on, this happened in the courtyard of the Gentiles, which was a place where the Gentiles, people who were not Jewish, were invited to come in to worship God. This was meant to be the place which was a reminder to the Jewish people that they were meant to go out into the world to bring God, not just to the Jewish people, but to all people. That everybody had a place to worship God. Everyone had a place around God's family. But what they did is they turned the place for the Gentiles into a marketplace. Almost as if they didn't care for them to be missionary people, for them to reach out and bring God to people beyond their own family. And we can easily become like this at times. It's safe just talking about God in the context of our own family. It's much more difficult to talk about God out in the world and to then bring those out in the world in to experience God and to worship God. But this was a dedicated place within the temple designed for those who were not Jewish. And this had become the marketplace. And so Jesus has a zeal for the house, not just because they were not worshipping God correctly, but because they had forgotten that their mission was also to bring Christ to the Gentiles. A big part of what the New Testament is we have the Gospels, but then it is the story of the apostles bringing Christ to the Gentiles. Big part of Paul's story is bringing Christ to the pagans, to those beyond the Jewish faith. And you look at the life and the ministry of Pope John Paul II. He visited place after place to bring Christ to those who didn't know of Christ. And during the papacy of Pope St. John Paul II, the church had its largest increase in number of Catholics in the history of humanity, right throughout Africa, parts of Asia, parts of South America, where people who had never heard of the gospel came to believe in Jesus Christ. We are a church of the right worship of God, but we are also a church that is missionary. We bring Christ not just to our family, but to those who have not heard of Christ. And so that was a strike as well. And the third strike is in relation to the third mission of Christ and the mission of the church, which is care for the poor. Sometimes we talk about having a preferential option for the poor. So what was going on? Again, we know from scholars that in the week of Passover in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, and for a significant period of time up until the destruction of the temple, is that literally hundreds of thousands of Jewish people would come from all over the world, mainly from around Galilee and from elsewhere, would descend upon Jerusalem for the week of Passover. And part of that experience is they would bring normally a lamb, or they might bring pigeons that would then be offered in sacrifice by one of the priests. We're told by scholars that in the week leading up to Passover, in the ranges between 25 to 30,000 lambs would be processed into Jerusalem to be offered in sacrifice. They would be then offered to God, and then the family would take the meat of the lamb and then would prepare it, cook it, and share in the Passover meal. This was the practice that would have happened. But there was a great, you could say, organised crime that was happening in Jerusalem. And Jesus gets very annoyed by this as well. What was happening is there were good families from Bethlehem or Nazareth or from other places who would nurture a newborn lamb. And they would protect this lamb and they would bring it with them. The wealth of their family, this newborn lamb, they would bring it with them on their journey to Jerusalem. They'd come to Jerusalem and there would be health inspectors who would decide, no, this is not good enough to be accepted in sacrifice. You have to take this home. They wouldn't allow it to be offered. And they wouldn't allow it to be offered because there had been a deal done with certain farmers who had said, we are the official supplier of lambs and pigeons for sacrifice. And anybody else who brings their own lamb is going to be considered invalid. It's pretty reasonable organised crime. Well, these poor people who'd come from Bethlehem and Nazareth and all these other places that we know, they then had to purchase one of these official lambs. But they couldn't use the money that they had, which was Roman money. They had to change it into Jewish money. But of course, they couldn't change it without having to pay commission. So they got ripped off on that side as well. And so the poor were being ripped off all over the place. Everybody was in on this scam. The health inspectors, the money changers, the police, the priests. They were all together ripping off the poor. And Jesus says, this is not on. We are a church that goes to the poor, as Pope Francis says. We're a church that goes to those who are most vulnerable. And Jesus says, this is the third strike. You mess up in your right worship of God, that's a problem. You forget to become a missionary and to take Christ to others, to take God to the Gentiles, well, that's a problem. But you then also rip off the poor. Well, that's three strikes. And Jesus says, this is not on. And so Jesus comes in and literally causes a riot. The police are there, everybody are there, but they do not arrest Jesus. They could easily have taken Jesus away then and had him put to death because he had caused a massive disturbance. But that's not what happens. They ask Jesus, under whose authority do you think you can do this? They knew what was going on was wrong. And they knew that Jesus had a point. He had a point to rattle the cages a little bit, literally to let the pigeons go free. Because what Jesus was doing was right. We are about the right worship of God. We are about the mission to the whole world to bring all the world to experience God. And we are about the care of the poor and the most vulnerable. How are we going to respond to the missions of Christ? All of us at times perhaps needed to be rattled as well. Where is our relationship with Christ? Are we just coming to worship to make ourselves feel wealthier in this world? Do we come to worship as an insurance policy? Have we ever talked to Christ, to our neighbours or to others? And do we have a care for the poor, the sick and the vulnerable? This is the challenge of this gospel. It is a very challenging gospel. You don't see Jesus get angry very often. But when Jesus does get angry, we should pay attention. This is an important gospel for us in our journey as Christians. Pope Benedict reminded us that we must worship God. Right worship of God. Pope John Paul II reminds us we must be missionary to take Christ to the world. And Pope Francis has been reminding us over and over again the church must care for the poor and the vulnerable. We must go to the margins. Let's live out these three missions of Christ as we journey towards Easter.